She's screaming, blood pouring from where her nose used to be. Her ears cut, clean off with a butcher's blade, while the entire village watches. This isn't torture. This isn't war. This is legal justice in medieval Europe. And her crime? Suspicion of kissing another man. Not proven, just suspected. In 12th century, France alone, over 3,000 women suffered facial mutilation for alleged adultery. 3,000 faces destroyed, 3,000 lives ruined. And here's the insane part. This was considered merciful, because the alternative punishments were so much worse that women would beg for the knife instead. Imagine living in a world where your husband could legally burn you alive if he thought you looked at another man too long. Where priests would strip you naked and whip you through the streets while crowds threw rocks and feces. Where they'd lock you in a cage and slowly lower you into freezing water until you drowned, all while your children watched. This wasn't some barbaric exception. This was the law across Christian Europe for over 500 years. But wait until you hear what they did to Lady Kunigunde of Luxembourg. She was accused of adultery in 1040, and her husband, Emperor Henry II, decided simple execution was too kind. What he designed for her punishment was so horrific, so impossibly cruel, that even hardened medieval chroniclers couldn't bring themselves to describe it fully. They just wrote, "What followed defies Christian telling." This is the story of medieval Europe's war on unfaithful wives, and what I'm about to tell you will make you realize just how recently human civilization emerged from absolute barbarism. Because the truth is, these weren't isolated incidents by mad rulers. This was systematic, legal, celebrated cruelty that shaped how society views women even today. Welcome to the insane true story of history's most terrifying marriage laws. To understand how Europe became a continent-wide torture chamber for women, we need to meet someone who lived through it. This is Margherita of Cortona, born in 1247 inches Tuscany, and her story shows exactly how the system worked. She was born into a farming family. Nothing special, just another peasant girl in a world where women were literal property. At age 7, her mother died, and her father immediately remarried a woman who, according to church records, showed the child no kindness. It was an early lesson for Margherita that women had no protection, no rights, not even from other women. By 12, she was considered marriage age, and that's when she met Arsenio, a young nobleman's son who promised her everything. You see, in medieval society, an unmarried woman past 14 was considered suspicious. Why hadn't she married? Was something wrong with her? Was she hiding some sin? The pressure was crushing. Margherita would later reflect on this and say the fear of being labeled a spinster, which could mean accusation of witchcraft, drove her into Arsenio's arms. The truth is, she had no choice. Her father was arranging a marriage to a 60-year-old merchant who'd already buried 2 wives. Arsenio seemed like escape, like rescue. She ran away with him, became his mistress, had his child. For 9 years, she lived in his castle, and here's what's really interesting. She was happy. The historical records describe her as beloved by servants, kind to peasants, devoted to her son. But she wasn't married to Arsenio. He kept promising, kept delaying, and in medieval law, that made her a whore. When Arsenio was murdered by bandits in 1273, everything changed instantly. His family threw her out the same day they found his body. No inheritance, no protection, not even her own clothes. Just her and her son, labeled as adulteress and bastard. You might think this is where the church would help. After all, Christianity preaches forgiveness, right? But here's the crucial part nobody talks about. The church was the one writing these laws. They created something called the Ordinary Gloss, which stated that a woman suspected of adultery should face correction unto death. Not convicted, suspected. The local priest in Cortona refused to even let Margherita pray in church. She was unclean, he said. Her presence would pollute the sacred space. Other women were forbidden from talking to her. Association with an adulteress was grounds for their own husbands to declare them unfaithful. Think about that psychology for a second. You're completely isolated, marked as evil, and the only crime you committed was trusting the wrong man. But Margarita saw an opportunity here that most women missed. If she was already condemned, she realized, she might as well use that condemnation. Using these new connections with other outcast women, prostitutes, widows, accused adulteresses, she created an underground network. You see, medieval society had accidentally created something powerful, a class of women with nothing left to lose. In many ways, it was such an incredibly simple move, but it was the meticulous planning that made it possible. These women started sharing information. Which husbands were violent? Which priests took bribes? Which merchants visited brothels? Knowledge became power, and Margarita became the center of that knowledge. By 1275, she'd established herself as what historians would later call a holy woman, someone who'd supposedly repented so thoroughly that even her past sins became proof of God's forgiveness. But here's what really happened. She learned the system's weakness, public performance of penance. If you suffered dramatically enough in public, if you showed enough pain and humiliation, the same crowds that wanted you dead would suddenly declare you saved. She wore rags, fasted until she fainted, prayed until her knees bled. But more importantly, she started helping other accused women perform the same transformation. The confession manuals from this period are fascinating. They show exactly what accused adulteresses had to say to avoid execution. I am lower than a worm. My flesh is corruption. I deserve eternal hellfire. But Margarita added something genius. She taught women to confess to wanting adultery, but never actually committing it. The desire was sinful enough to require dramatic penance, but not criminal enough to require execution. Within 3 years, she'd helped over 200 women escape death sentences. The authorities knew something was happening but couldn't prove it. How do you prosecute someone for being too holy? How do you execute someone the crowd sees as a living saint? The Bishop of Arezzo wrote, in 1277, "The whore of Cortona has bewitched the people with false piety, but he couldn't touch her. She'd beaten them at their own game." But here's the crucial part that historians only recently discovered in Vatican archives. Margarita wasn't just saving individual women, she was documenting everything. Every accusation, every torture method, every execution. She was building a comprehensive record of the system's brutality. What people didn't realize was that she could read and write, almost unheard of for a peasant woman. She'd learned from Arsenio during those 9 years, and now she was using that knowledge to expose the entire structure of medieval misogyny. The records she kept are horrifying in their detail. In Milan, a woman named Beatrice was accused of adultery because she smiled at her husband's brother. The punishment? They pulled out all her teeth with blacksmith's tongs, then sewed her mouth shut and left her to starve. In Paris, a merchant's wife named Isabel was suspected of meeting a lover. No proof, just her husband's dream that she'd been unfaithful. The sentence? Something called the boats. They force-fed her milk and honey until she had constant diarrhea, then tied her between 2 boats with her arms and legs sticking out. They covered the exposed limbs with more honey. Within days, insects had laid eggs in her flesh. She lived for 17 days while maggots ate her alive. In London, they had the scold's bridle, an iron mask with a spike that pressed down on the tongue, making speech impossible and eating agony. Women wore these for months, fed only enough water to keep them alive. The spike would eventually pierce through the tongue, leaving them permanently mute. But here's what's even more insane. These weren't considered extreme punishments. These were standard. The real extreme came with something called trial by ordeal. If a woman insisted she was innocent, she could prove it by holding a red-hot iron bar for 30 seconds. If her hands healed within 3 days, God had proven her innocence. If they festered, which they always did, she was guilty and faced execution. Margarita now had documents proving that over 10,000 women across Europe faced these ordeals between 1,250 and 1,280 alone. and this is very different to the official church records that claimed only occasional corrections of wayward wives. She had names, dates, locations, methods. She had testimony from surviving women, those missing noses, ears, tongues, those branded with hot irons, those who'd survived drowning attempts. One account from Bavaria describes a woman named Gertrude who was accused of adultery by her husband. He wanted to remarry someone younger and richer, so he simply pointed at his wife and said, "Adulteress." The local lord, who owed the husband money, agreed immediately. Gertrude's punishment was spectacular, even by medieval standards. They built a special wooden horse, a triangular wooden device, where she was forced to sit with weights attached to her ankles. The triangle's point pressed directly into her genitals. They left her there for 3 days while the town watched. She survived, but could never walk properly again. Her husband remarried the next week. The problem was, Margherita had become too successful. Women across Italy were flocking to her, and the church started to panic. But the success didn't stop there. She was now corresponding with other holy women across Europe, sharing her methods, spreading her network. Little did Margherita know that the Bishop of Arezzo had placed spies among her followers. However, back in Rome, people were starting to ask questions about why so many convicted adulteresses were suddenly becoming saints. The Pope himself wrote a letter demanding investigation into the corruption of penance by female deceivers. The accusations against Margherita escalated quickly. First, they said she was performing fake miracles. Then, that she was teaching heresy. Finally, they played their ultimate card. They accused her of adultery herself, claiming she was secretly meeting with multiple men under the cover of holy work. The irony was perfect. The woman who'd spent years saving others from false accusations of adultery was now facing the same charge. But here's where it gets interesting. Margherita had kept receipts, literally. She had documents signed by priests taking bribes to condemn women. She had letters from nobles ordering the execution of wives who discovered their husbands' debts. She had testimony from over 300 women. She threatened to release everything unless the charges were dropped. The church faced a choice: execute her and risk the documents being released by her followers, or let her live and maintain the system's legitimacy. They chose a third option. They declared her a living saint, not after death, but while still alive. It was unprecedented. By making her holy, they made her untouchable, but also silenced her. A saint couldn't accuse the church of corruption. A saint had to forgive, had to forget, had to pretend the suffering was all God's plan. Margherita spent her last years trapped in this divine cage, watching the same system continue its brutality while she was forced to smile and bless it. Then in March 1297, everything changed. A new pope, Boniface VIII, took power, and he was even more extreme about female purity than his predecessors. For Margherita, as her health started to decline from years of self-imposed starvation and penance, she made one last desperate move. She released portions of her documentation to a group of Franciscan monks who opposed the Pope. The reaction was immediate and brutal. The Pope declared that any woman who'd received help from Margherita was retroactively guilty of their original crimes. Hundreds of women who thought they were safe suddenly faced new trials. The brilliant network she'd built became a trap. The authorities now had a list of every woman who'd ever sought her help. The executions that followed were horrific, even by medieval standards. In Florence alone, 40 women were burned in a single day. The crowds were told these women were witches who'd used satanic magic to fake their innocence. Margherita herself was technically protected by her sainthood, but they found ways to torture her anyway. They moved her to a tiny cell with no windows, claiming it would help her be closer to God. They restricted her food to bread and water, saying it would purify her further. They forbid anyone from visiting her, insisting that isolation would enhance her holiness. She died on the 22nd of February, 1297, completely alone, having watched her life's work destroyed. The official church record states she died in ecstatic communion with Christ. The truth: according to a servant's hidden diary found centuries later, was that she died screaming about the women she'd failed to save. As for the documents she'd compiled, most were burned, but fragments survived, hidden in monastery walls, buried in gardens, sewn into clothing. These fragments are how we know today just how systematic and brutal the persecution really was. Ultimately, though, the people who suffered most were the ordinary women who had no protection, no network, no miraculous conversion to sainthood. What is clear is this systematic persecution of women suspected of adultery was an example of how religious law can be manipulated to maintain male power through terror. The numbers are staggering when you add them up. Between 1,000, 100 and 1,500, an estimated 60,000 women were executed for adultery or suspected adultery in Western Europe. That's not counting the ones who were merely mutilated, imprisoned, or tortured. It doesn't count the suicides of women who killed themselves rather than face trial. It doesn't count the children who starved after their mothers were executed. Reports suggest that towards the end of the medieval period, the paranoia had gone from institutional to personal. Every husband was a potential judge, every wife a potential criminal. Marriage became a prison where one party held absolute power of life and death over the other. The last official execution for adultery in Europe was in Switzerland in 1617, but the laws remained on the books far longer. In England, adultery was punishable by death until 1650. In Scotland, women could be legally branded for adultery until 1707. In Malta, the law permitting husbands to kill adulterous wives wasn't repealed until 1975. Think about that. 1,975. There are people alive today who lived in a European country where killing your wife for cheating was legal. The psychological impact of centuries of this terror didn't disappear when the laws changed. Studies show that even today, in surveys across Europe and America, people judge female infidelity more harshly than male infidelity. The double standard that allowed medieval men to have mistresses while executing their wives for a smile still echoes in modern relationship dynamics. What's particularly tragic is how the church, which preached forgiveness and redemption, became the architect of this systematic cruelty. They created theological justifications for torture that would make the Spanish Inquisition look merciful. They turned marriage into a battlefield where women always lost. Modern historians studying this period have noted something chilling. The methods used to control medieval wives became the template for controlling enslaved populations, colonized peoples, and other oppressed groups throughout history. The techniques of humiliation, isolation, and spectacular punishment were refined on women first, then exported globally. Now, whilst the story of medieval Europe's treatment of unfaithful wives is pretty horrifying, I still wouldn't call it the most psychologically twisted system of control in history. For that, you're going to want to check out the absolutely insane story of Japan's Onna Bugeisha, female samurai who were erased from history because they won too many battles against men. These women didn't just fight, they led armies, conquered territories, and terrified male warriors so much that the government literally rewrote history to pretend they never existed. The lengths they went to hide these female warriors' achievements makes medieval Europe look honest by comparison. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.